Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 32 of Series 7. The question for today is, can truth or the will to truth qualify value or the will to value? The reading from one of my works, The Will to Value, Chapter 4, Section 3. In previous weeks, we have been discussing various criteria and conditions of value as a principle of life. We looked at how value has primacy over the other key states of cognition, affect and will. Instances of these were happiness, knowledge, truth and morality, as well as consciousness itself. Having singled out value, we then discussed various criteria in order to find priority amongst different values. Some of those criteria were coherence, consistency, truth, quality, self-validation and sufficiency. And last week we compared and contrasted Nietzsche's will to power with the will to value. Before that, we discussed value in a dialectical relation with supporting cognitive frameworks, and we saw that truth acted as a crucial qualification of cognition in that dialectical relation. And we earlier discussed a symmetry between truth and value or moral value. That is, both truth and value or moral value make inescapable claims on the human will. So today we must discuss the nature of truth and its relation to value and values. That is, how can truth be something that we can will, search for or pursue? There are numerous ways in which the concept of truth can involve value. Three of them are as follows. 1. As the value or possible intrinsic value of truth, which isn't today's question. 2. How does value enter into or moderate the concept of truth, undermining its objectivity? Thirdly, today's question is, how can truth be a criterion of value or the will to value? On this view, truth is taken as a property of cognition that qualifies the object of value. In the search for truth, truth has traditionally been defined as an objective or an absolute concept. Stoics, Christians and rationalists believe that the truth will make you free. Others believe that simply knowing the truth will answer their questions and resolve their problems. Tolstoy, for example, said that truth has been, is and will be beautiful. Nietzsche countered this idea by saying that the truth is ugly. Truth is neither beautiful nor ugly, but Nietzsche had to describe it as such. He described it as such to counter mistaken presuppositions and to show its indifference to human wishes. In his 1886 preface to The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche opposes the idea that the truth will make you free. He opposes absolute standards that begin with the truthfulness of God that don't allow for humanity. That is, people pursue beauty, power, wealth and comfort, but religion condemns them for doing so. And in failing absolute standards, they experience guilt and resentment against life. Yet what we find in Nietzsche isn't a clear message, but an apparent ambivalence towards truth. In his work Ecce Homo, Nietzsche tells us that the truth is terrible. he finds that Socrates perversely equates reason with virtue, but he affirms life in his teachings of amor fati and eternal recurrence. This is a reconciliation and coming to terms with the facts of life as they are. Yet this ambivalence hangs on what we understand the truth to be. Nietzsche's ambivalence towards truth can be resolved by making an important distinction. The distinction is between the truth about the world that is terrible and a conception of truth that is ugly. Pontius Pilate, for example, asked Jesus, "What is truth?" Was Pilate thinking, how can this shepherd know about the complicated concept of truth? Was Jesus thinking, how can this bureaucrat know about the mysteries of truth? Was it possible that neither of them had any idea about the character of truth? There are many different views about the nature of truth. For example, whether it's subjective or as absolutely objective. This subjective-objective distinction is also described as one between nominalism and realism. Most philosophical thinking largely favours the subjective or nominalist view. Yet many philosophers take objectivist positions on such topics. We have previously distinguished different applications of truth that understand truth in different ways. Different applications such as logic and mathematics, science, human perception, and moral values. Knowledge, for example, is often defined as true belief, and truth is often conceived by how we understand knowledge. And knowledge can be understood differently as scientific or first person or third person or in other ways. Isaiah Berlin cites what he calls 3 perennial dogmas of truth and knowledge in the Western world. These are that A, that every genuine question has one true answer and one only. B, the method which leads to correct solutions to all genuine problems is rational in character. And C, that these solutions are true universally, eternally, and immutably. This is a representation of a particularly conservative conception of truth and knowledge, yet an accurate one. We can present many other more moderate, as I see them, perspectives on truth and knowledge. John McDowell, Thomas Nagel, and Bernard Williams, for example, criticized the idea of an absolute conception of the world. Nagel recognizes the significance of both the subjectivity and the human capacity to take an objective view. But Nagel qualifies this idea of stepping back into greater and greater objectivity. That is, it will always be possible to step even further back, and the Archimedean point of objectivity will never be reached. Nagel calls this impossibly objective view the view from nowhere. Yet Charles Peirce poses a scientifically based convergence theory of truth and knowledge. That is, we can attain increasingly correct perspectives with the expected outcome of a final truth. Like William James, Charles Peirce also held a pragmatic theory of truth. But there are serious challenges to this prospect of science attaining a final or objective truth, even in principle. For example, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle holds that we can't know both the position and speed of a particle. This shows that there are aspects of science that cannot be known as objective truths. Science is also an a posteriori discipline that determines knowledge pragmatically in terms of what works. But pragmatic theories of truth and knowledge have limitations because they regard truth as the perceived order of things. For example, different species of animals have different colour systems which work perfectly well. But none of these systems, including that of humans, can be legitimately described as true. This is because there is no truth about colour in the external world. And there are more difficult problems for the concept of truth with the discovery of different theories of truth. A correspondence theory relies upon an ambiguous relation between statement and fact. Coherence theory may have the rational coherence of a madman without reference to empirical fact. And a pragmatic theory of truth as what works incurs problems as above of science, colour and others. But an even greater problem of these failures is that these differences indicate that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but a subjective human artifact. And choosing any one theory of truth requires reference to another or other theories. But such theories would also require justification, leading back into an infinite regress. Yet we can also mention another problem in the form of Simon Blackburn's redundancy theory of truth. That is, the reference to truth adds nothing to our descriptions of the world. For example, to say that the truth is that it is raining is the same as saying it is raining. These kinds of problems lead to various thinkers to using the concept of truth in very different ways. Kant defined truth not as a quantitative but a regulative concept that guides rather than determines. Karl Popper defined truth as a regulative idea as it is unknowable, yet offers criteria of falsehood. And Paniel Rees Cardenas finds truth as a regulative attitude in both Hegel and Kierkegaard. My view is then that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, it is a value-laden human artifact. There is no final theory of truth or a definitive conception of any truth. Yet it functions well as a regulative concept or attitude in guiding human behaviour. The question is, given its anthropocentric basis, how can truth regulate human behaviour? Kant and Popper regarded truth as a regulative concept, yet so did Nietzsche and Bernard Williams. Nietzsche's tacit will to truth is found in his affirmations of life, his yea sayings and amor fati. Clark and Dudrick found Nietzsche's will to truth in a tension with a will to value. One way in which truth has been taken to be a regulative principle is by regarding it as an intrinsic value. But there are a number of objections to this view, such as as above, truth is an anthropologically constructed concept that is attributed with value and not of intrinsic value. Secondly, truth is a mode of cognition which in principle excludes value content. Thirdly, arguments like Mackie's hold that there are no objective or intrinsic values in the external world. Fourthly, as above, I myself hold that only mental states and people are candidates of intrinsic value. And lastly, many intrinsic values are trivial, which precludes them as regulative principles. Yet Williams presents a very qualified concept of truth that nevertheless provides guidance for action. Williams rejects both truth as an absolute conception of the world and that truth has intrinsic value. Yet he admonishes the deniers of the truth and holds that we need an unconditional will to truth. I find the unconditional in this unconditional will to truth understandably problematic. It seems to be a version of Derek Parfit's doing things for their own sake. But this seems to go against the reasoning above. Yet responding to both his own anthropocentric position and to the deniers of truth, Williams asks, if you do not really believe in the existence of truth, what is the passion for truthfulness a passion for? And he answers with what he calls the virtues of truth, of sincerity and accuracy. But he doesn't explain why we should have a passion for sincerity or accuracy. Moreover, Williams' anthropocentricity goes further to quote Donald Davidson saying that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained, and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Yet we have seen another way of bringing will, value and truth together with the indefinability of truth. That is, I have previously argued that the indefinability of both truth and the highest human good is fortuitous. It is fortuitous because truth and morality share a property which recommend them as values, and that property is possibility or absence, which opens up value to further value. To review that point, we can repeat that truth and morality make inescapable claims that we ought to take up. But what is it that motivates us to affirm or will the truth? Is it the sheer conception of truth alone, or is it the value that we seek in pursuing the truth? Truth itself isn't of intrinsic value, and the value of truth is found to be contingent. It is rather that the truth is lit up by the values that motivate us to seek it. And to emphasize the point, there is no definitive theory of truth or final content of any particular truth. Yet this absence of a definitive theory or content of any truth has implications for value. That is, the quality or kind of value can be determined by its object, and the value of truth and the moral good have similar kind of objects. That is, there could be no final conception of either truth or the good. The indefinability of both truth and moral values binds them together into a special kind of relation. What we have here is a symmetry between truth and the moral good as value. Both their objects are ultimately indefinable, and both claim ultimate obligations on the individual. But because we pursue them, we also have a symmetry between the will to truth and the good will. To explain further, one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. That is, because it was irreducible and shouldn't be confused with natural properties like pleasant. John McDowell had a similar view about the uncodifiability of action in Aristotle's virtue theory. I disagree with More that we can't define the character of moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we cannot definitively define any particular moral good or the highest moral good. This is because they are always liable to reformulation and further discovery. This leads to a comparison of the lack of a final conception of truth and no final conception of the good. The indefinability of both truth and moral values bring together into a certain relation. That is, the comparison of truth and value leads them to evoking similar kinds of value. This is because the character of value is largely determined or expressed by its objects. In this case, the objects of truth and value are ultimately indefinable, and both claim ultimate obligations on our will. So what we have here is a symmetry between the will to truth and value or moral values. And this symmetry is evident in the systematic incompleteness of both truth and moral values. And the significance of this symmetry is to draw truth and value closer together. That is, value becomes more dependent on truth as we had defined it, and the will to truth can be seen as a way of propagating value to further value. I should now describe the incompleteness of truth and moral value in terms of what I have called attenuated cognition. That is, cognition is not only found in many complex relations but also in degrees. For example, it's often asked in religious and other contexts how strongly one believes, or with respect to knowledge, it is asked how deeply one knows something, or we can speak of limited contrasts or context or backgrounds of understanding. And we can also speak of graduated cognitive frameworks as a moral criterion in different degrees of support. One example is moral fortitude when doing the right thing without social or cognitive support. So one account of moral fortitude is having an independence from cognitive frameworks, and conversely, excessive or unwarranted support is a moral failing and it isn't desirable. Examples of a lack of this kind of independence can be found in William's notion of self-indulgence, and existentialists relish inadequately informed choices as occasions of freedom and authenticity. For example, Sartre's spirit of seriousness decries accepting values as objective, thereby fleeing freedom. In my view, this notion of moral independence is an ethical principle consistent with the idea of value sufficiency. I'm not at the moment arguing for such an ethical principle as a moral truth or as a truth of value, but I'm making a comparison between the character of truth and that of morals and value. That is, they are both indefinable in principle and make inescapable claims on our will. And the indefinability of truth promotes value in several ways. One of these is its openness to possibility, which enable particular values to develop further value. Another is that indefinability is a form of absence of a specific conception of something, and the absence of cognitive support has been presented as a moral virtue. On the other hand, the truth can motivate people because they believe it is an intrinsic or absolute value, or the truth can motivate because it has abstruse properties that people recognize. But such explanations don't satisfy a need for a deeper understanding of these relations. That is, we can ask the question, what does the pursuit or the will to truth lead to? It doesn't lead to an objective conception of the world, but offers a nirvana-like experience. It eventually leads to an indefinable conception of truth that is inducive to value and further value. So at this junction, we should review the different conceptions of truth that we have looked at. Firstly, we looked at truth straightforwardly as a concept like any other. Yet secondly, it wasn't quite like any other, as there was an overwhelming evidence of its indefinability. Thirdly, truth is a mode of cognition affecting quality of cognition in belief, knowledge or vagueness. And fourthly, as stated by Res Cardinus and implied by the will to truth, truth is also an attitude. Yet in all these different circumstances we can find an interesting pattern. It is a pattern between truth as cognition and value as a supposedly non-cognitive state. I previously described this relation in terms of a dialectic, but in analytic philosophy this distinction is presented in the form of the cognitive non-cognitive debate. That is reason or feeling the primary principle of explanation in morals, motivation, meaning or purpose? Cognitivists would argue that reason, truth or a conception of things is an adequate explanation. Non-cognitivists argue that a will to truth isn't possible without a value component. In practice, both cognitive and non-cognitive components are required. This is another way of relating truth and value. To show how truth is a property of cognition in practice, we can review some types of cognition that affect value. Religion has been noted as a paradigm cognitive framework which supports religious value states. Other people and social esteem are seen to be powerful forces in maintaining self-esteem. And I presented attenuated cognition as a way of describing limited cognitive support as a virtue. I have also previously noted some more esoteric examples of different modes of cognition. Sartre's spirit of seriousness, for example, finds bad faith in taking subjective values as objective to hide behind. Phenomenologists are interested in ideas as cognitive objects which shape the character of consciousness. Husserl, for example, speaks of presentations in the flesh, in desiring or fearing, bodily presence, memory or fantasy. He also believes in graduated perceptions with greater or lesser degrees of the sensory in them, and such graduations accommodate graduations of value and moral action. In conclusion, we can review what we have said about truth, the will to truth and the will to value. We first looked at different conceptions of truth and different views about its significance. That is, there is an important distinction to be made between questions about the nature of truth and questions about the supposed good or bad consequences of apprehending the truth about the world. This paper attempted a synthesis between these two questions. We began with the well-established view that both truth and truth about the world are anthropocentric constructions. Yet many thinkers like Kant and Popper still regarded the concept of truth as having a regulative function. And we had to ask, how could it maintain this regulative function? One clue was that both truth and moral value make inescapable claims on our will. And moreover, we found that the concept of truth was indefinable in principle, like the highest good. Yet this is fortuitous, because this indefinability is an absence that is inducive to value. and in this way the will to truth is also compatible with the will to value. This conclusion conveniently supports my general thesis or synthesis, if it can include concepts like truth, that our inescapable objective in life is a pursuit or a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like YouTube or meetup.com.